go live to Bristol and speak to the consultant clinical psychologist Lucy Johnstone. Thanks very much indeed for joining us, Dr. Johnstone. 1 in 8 children aged between 5 and 19 have what this report describes as some kind of mental disorder. Does that surprise you?
It doesn't surprise me. I think this is a very thorough survey and report, and it actually confirms a lot of what other surveys and reports have said. So it's not surprising, but it's clearly very alarming.
Can you give us some idea of what might be behind this?
One of the interesting things about this report is it does suggest some of the things that may be behind this. And as a psychologist, the thing I would query about the report is some of the language in which it's expressed. So it talks about disorders and illnesses. And actually, there's very little evidence that these very real and difficult experiences are best understood as disorders and illnesses with causes like biochemical imbalances and so on. There is a great deal of evidence that these very difficult experiences can be understood as a response to life circumstances. And the report actually makes a link with some of those. And they're things like coming from families which are struggling emotionally or financially, like being bullied, like making the very difficult transition to adult life. So there seem to be very understandable reasons why young people and children are feeling the way they are.
And what about, you talk about some people having very difficult family lives. For others who don't, what about impacts of day-to-day life and the way in which they've changed? So a lot of teenagers will now be using social media where they may not have done in the past. So what impact does that, for example, have? Because some people worry that that puts extra pressures and anxieties on young people.
The report does suggest that social media is not helping. So some of the more unhappy young people were spending a great deal of time on social media and were using it to make comparisons between themselves and other people, which left them feeling worse off. So clearly that's not a helpful factor. But I think we also need to look more widely than that. Only last week we had a United Nations report looking at the devastating impact of austerity on society as a whole, on families. Of course, this filters down to children. Actually, I think the report is picking up some of this where it talks about children struggling in families that are on benefits, for example. But these kind of, social factors affect all of us, even if we're lucky enough to come from relatively secure families, as many of these children do. We're living in a difficult world. Children are a barometer of our society. We cannot go on waiting until every single child in the country is labelled with a disorder and is on a clinic waiting list. We do need more resources for mental health difficulties, but we also need to look very clearly at the kind of world we're bringing our children into, and we need to address this distress much more, I think, at its root causes.
And what do you make of the gender splits here? Because one of the statistics is that young women aged between 17 and 19 were twice as likely as young men to have problems. And I know that it's different amongst the younger children. I think the boys, when they're much younger, have more problems than girls, then it levels out. And then, as I say, in this older age group, it's more young women that have problems. What do you make of that?
The report was a bit inconclusive about that, and it's always difficult to say exactly, but there are, I guess, good reasons why young women may be under particular pressures, perhaps about their appearance, perhaps they may be more vulnerable to certain forms of abuse. So, yeah, I guess that's a factor as well. But actually, levels of distress were also pretty high among young men in that same age bracket, and levels of distress seem to increase the older the child got and the more they came face to face with what I think is at the moment a very difficult period of transition. It's always difficult, but particularly difficult to transition into young adulthood when so much is, really up, very insecure. Can I pay for my university education? Will I get a job? Will I be able to buy a house? All those things are bound to impact upon young people's mental health. And actually, it's not necessarily helpful to call the resulting distress an illness or disorder, because that stops us really, I think, from looking clearly at the very difficult lives that some of our young people are leading.
And would you say that this is a growing problem, or is it the case that generally we're better at diagnosing mental health issues? Perhaps kids are better at talking about it and coming forward, and adults are better at recognising that they are suffering from mental health issues?
It may be a bit of both, but actually there's all sorts of evidence that distress is increasing, and that's not just for young people, of course, but young people are not going to be an exception to a general rule whereby wider social factors increase distress across the population. These are difficult times we live in, and it's not surprising that we can see some of those tensions played out in the lives of our young people, who actually deserve better. And I would say they actually deserve better than to be diagnosed, which can have a message of, there's something wrong with me. Mostly people are experiencing and showing understandable responses to things that are actually very difficult for anyone to deal with, particularly children and young people. And diagnosis isn't always the best way forward. Understanding life context is nearly always a much better way forward.
And clearly you were talking about the root causes, and it's a very big job to change lots of those circumstances that people are living through at the moment. But on a more superficial level, is there any advice that parents can take generally in terms of encouraging children to sleep more, for example, cutting down on screen time? Can those kind of things make any kind of difference?
They certainly can. They certainly can. And, things like having hobbies and interests and a good circle of friends, all of those things, exercise, they can actually often be more helpful than the things that people, sometimes turn to too quickly, like taking psychiatric drugs, which of course have a role, but clearly they are not an answer for many people. So I would certainly encourage parents to do all of those things. And the report actually suggests that young people and children do get a lot of support from teachers, from educational support workers. So it's not to say those things aren't important, but we cannot leave the clearing up of the mess just to the people who are on the ground, if you like, dealing with often, overwhelming amounts of distress in our schools and other people where young people have to survive.
OK, well, Dr. Lucy Johnstone, very interesting to get your take on it. Thanks very much indeed for your time here this evening.
Thank you.